The spring of 1952 brought unusually heavy rains to the Dakota Territory. Margaret Thompson had lived in the small town of Cedar Falls for nearly 15 years, but she had never seen the rushing river swell to such dangerous levels. The muddy waters churned and roared past her modest farmhouse, carrying away everything in their path: fallen trees, debris from upstream farms, and the hopes of families who watched helplessly as their livelihoods disappeared beneath the brown torrent. Margaret stood on her front porch, gripping the wooden railing as she watched the chaos unfold before her eyes. At 53, she had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical. Her husband Robert had died in the war 5 years earlier, leaving her to manage their small farm alone. The community had rallied around her initially, but as time passed and her grief became a private burden, the visits grew less frequent, and the offers of help dwindled to polite nods at the general store. The river had been rising for 3 days straight. What started as gentle rain on Monday had transformed into a relentless downpour by Wednesday evening. Now, on this gray Friday morning, the water had jumped its banks and was creeping steadily toward the houses that dotted the valley floor. Margaret's farmhouse sat on higher ground, built by her late husband's grandfather, who had possessed the wisdom to choose his location carefully. She was safe, but many of her neighbors were not so fortunate. Through the driving rain, she could see the Hendersons' barn, its red paint faded but still visible above the waterline. The family had evacuated yesterday, loading their wagon with whatever possessions they could carry and heading for higher ground near the church. Most of the valley residents had done the same, following the sheriff's urgent warnings and the advice of older folks who remembered the Great Flood of 1897. Margaret pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and squinted through the gray morning light. Something was moving in the water near the old oak tree that marked the boundary between her property and the reservation lands. At first, she thought it might be debris, perhaps a broken fence post or a lost chicken coop. But as she watched more carefully, she realized the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful to be random floating objects. She hurried inside and grabbed her husband's old field glasses from the mantelpiece. Robert had used them during hunting season and for keeping watch over their livestock. Margaret rarely touched them, as they reminded her too sharply of his absence, but now she needed to see what was happening in that churning water. Adjusting the focus with trembling fingers, she peered through the lenses toward the oak tree, her breath caught in her throat. 2 small figures were clinging to the massive trunk, barely visible above the rushing water. Even from this distance, she could see they were children, young boys, perhaps 8 or 10 years old. Their dark hair was plastered to their heads by the rain, and their thin arms wrapped desperately around whatever branches they could reach. Margaret's heart began to race. Where had these children come from? The reservation was on the other side of the river, normally a good half-mile walk through the meadow. But the flood had transformed the entire landscape, turning familiar fields into a dangerous lake. These boys must have been caught off guard by the rising water, perhaps trying to retrieve livestock or belongings before seeking safety. She lowered the field glasses and ran through her options. The town's volunteer fire department was already stretched thin, dealing with evacuations and rescue efforts throughout the valley. The sheriff and his deputy were helping families move to higher ground near the school building. Even if she could somehow contact them, it would take time she didn't think those boys had. The water was still rising, and the oak tree, sturdy as it was, wouldn't provide safety for much longer. Margaret had lived long enough to know that sometimes you had to act first and worry about consequences later. She pulled on her husband's old work boots, grateful that Robert had possessed large feet. The leather was cracked and worn, but the boots were waterproof and would provide better traction than her everyday shoes. She grabbed his heavy canvas coat from the closet, inhaling the faint scent of tobacco and pine soap that still clung to the fabric after all these years. In the barn, she found the small rowboat that Robert had built the summer before he enlisted. He had talked about taking fishing trips to the lake, about teaching their children to row when they were older. Those children had never come, and the boat had sat unused through years of dust and neglect. Margaret ran her hands along its sides, checking for cracks or weak spots. The wood seemed solid enough, though she wasn't sure about her own ability to handle it in such rough water. She dragged the boat from the barn, struggling with its weight but determined to reach the water's edge. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Margaret's feet slipped on the muddy ground as she pulled the boat toward what had once been the riverbank, but was now somewhere in the middle of her neighbor's cornfield. When she finally reached the water, Margaret paused to catch her breath and assess the situation. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, and the water was deeper than it looked from the safety of her porch. Pieces of debris rushed past, broken boards, an overturned chicken coop, what looked like someone's kitchen table. Getting to the oak tree would require more skill and strength than she possessed, but the alternative was to watch two children drown while waiting for help that might not arrive in time. Margaret said a quick prayer to whatever forces might be listening and pushed the boat into the muddy water. The current immediately tried to grab it and carry it downstream, but she managed to climb in and take hold of the oars before it could escape her completely. Robert had shown her the basics of rowing during their brief courtship, but that was more than 20 years ago, and those lessons had taken place on the calm waters of Miller's Pond, not in a raging flood. The boat responded sluggishly to her efforts, fighting against the current and spinning in directions she didn't intend to go. Margaret's arms began to ache within minutes, but she gritted her teeth and kept pulling at the oars, trying to angle toward the oak tree. The rain stung her eyes and made it difficult to maintain her bearings, but she could still make out the dark shape of the tree and the smaller shapes of the children clinging to its branches. As she drew closer, she could hear their voices carried on the wind, not words she could understand, but the universal sound of fear and desperation that transcends language barriers. The boys were calling to each other, perhaps trying to offer comfort or coordinate their efforts to stay above the water. Margaret realized they were speaking in Lakota, the language of the Sioux people who lived on the reservation. This knowledge should have surprised her, but somehow it didn't. The relationship between the town of Cedar Falls and the nearby reservation had always been complicated, marked by misunderstanding, mistrust, and occasional moments of grudging cooperation. Most of the white residents kept to themselves, conducting business when necessary but maintaining social distance the rest of the time. Margaret had been no different, following the unspoken rules of separation that governed their community. But children were children, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. These boys needed help, and she was the only person in a position to provide it. The politics and prejudices of the adult world seemed small and petty when measured against the simple urgency of saving two young lives. Margaret managed to maneuver the boat to within 20 feet of the oak tree, but the current was too strong to allow her to get closer without risking being swept away herself. She could see the boys clearly now. They were younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 7 and 9 years old. Both were shivering violently, their lips blue with cold despite the relative warmth of the spring air. They had been in the water for a long time, and exhaustion was clearly setting in. The older boy spotted her boat and began shouting in Lakota, pointing and gesturing frantically. Margaret couldn't understand his words, but his meaning was clear enough. He was asking for help, pleading with her to save them before the rising water carried them away. She tried to communicate back, using gestures to indicate that she was going to throw them a rope, but she quickly realized she had forgotten to bring any rope. Panic began to set in as Margaret considered her options. She could try to bring the boat closer, but the risk of being caught in the same trap as the children was too great. She could return to shore and attempt to find help, but that would take precious time the boys didn't have. Looking around the boat, she spotted a length of rope coiled near the bow Robert's old anchor line, forgotten until this moment. Margaret grabbed the rope and quickly tied one end to the boat's front seat, hoping the knot would hold under pressure. The rope was about 30 feet long, just enough to reach the tree if she could position the boat correctly. She began calling to the boys, pointing to the rope, and using hand signals to show them what she intended to do. The older boy seemed to understand. He spoke rapidly to his younger companion, and Margaret could see him pointing to different branches of the tree, apparently explaining some plan. The younger boy nodded, though his face was pale with exhaustion and fear. They were running out of time. The water level had risen noticeably even in the few minutes since Margaret had arrived, and the boys were having trouble maintaining their grip on the slippery bark. Margaret took a deep breath and threw the rope with all her strength. It arced through the air and landed short of the tree, falling into the churning water where the current immediately began to carry it away. She hauled it back quickly and tried again, this time aiming higher and putting more force behind the throw. The rope sailed over one of the lower branches but failed to catch, sliding off the wet bark and splashing into the water once more. On her third attempt, the rope wrapped around a sturdy branch about 8 feet above the water line. Margaret quickly secured her end and signaled to the boys. The older child didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope and began to work his way hand over hand toward the boat, his feet occasionally finding purchase on submerged branches, but mostly relying on his arms to support his weight. The journey across seemed to take forever. Margaret watched anxiously as the boy struggled against exhaustion and the constant pull of the current. Twice, his grip slipped and he nearly fell into the rushing water, but each time he managed to recover and continue his desperate progress towards safety. When he finally reached the boat, Margaret hauled him over the side, where he collapsed in a shivering heap on the bottom. She immediately turned her attention to the younger boy, who was still clinging to the oak tree. But something had changed in the few minutes it had taken his companion to cross. The child's grip was failing, and he seemed disoriented, probably suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. The older boy saw the danger and immediately began calling out in Lakota, his voice urgent and commanding despite his own weakened condition. Margaret didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone of desperate encouragement. She gestured for the younger boy to grab the rope, but he seemed unable or unwilling to let go of the tree branch. His eyes were wide with terror, and he kept looking down at the rushing water beneath him as if hypnotized by its power. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The water was still rising, and Margaret could see that other branches of the oak tree were beginning to bend under the pressure of the current. Soon, the boys' refuge would be completely submerged, and their chance for rescue would be lost. She had to act quickly, but she also had to be smart about it. Margaret made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. She tied the anchor rope around her waist and prepared to go into the water herself. The older boy, apparently understanding what she intended to do, began shaking his head frantically and speaking rapidly in Lakota. But Margaret had made up her mind. Sometimes, saving others required risking everything you had. She lowered herself carefully into the churning water, gasping at the cold and immediately feeling the powerful pull of the current. The rope held her secure to the boat, but maneuvering in the rushing water required strength she wasn't sure she possessed. Margaret began working her way toward the tree, using the rope as a guide and fighting to keep her head above the surface. The distance was only about 20 feet, but it felt like miles. Every few seconds, a piece of debris would crash into her, threatening to knock her unconscious or drag her under. The muddy water filled her mouth and nose, making it difficult to breathe. But Margaret kept moving forward, driven by the knowledge that 2 young lives depended on her courage and determination. When she finally reached the oak tree, she found the younger boy barely conscious, his small hands locked around a branch in a death grip that she couldn't break with gentle persuasion. Margaret realized she would have to pry his fingers loose and carry him back to the boat, a task that seemed nearly impossible given the conditions and her own exhaustion. But sometimes impossible things become possible when the alternative is unthinkable. Margaret managed to work one of the boy's hands loose from the branch, then the other, gathering his small body against her chest as the current immediately tried to sweep them both away. Only the rope connected to the boat kept them from being carried downstream into even greater danger. The journey back to the boat tested every ounce of strength Margaret had left. The boy was unconscious now, a dead weight in her arms, but she refused to let go. Hand over hand, she pulled herself along the rope, pausing frequently to rest and to make sure the child's face stayed above water. The older boy was leaning over the side of the boat, calling out encouragement in his own language and reaching out as if he could somehow help bridge the remaining distance. When Margaret finally reached the boat, she was too exhausted to lift herself and the unconscious boy over the side. The older child, despite his own weakened condition, grabbed his companion under the arms and helped pull him into the boat while Margaret pushed from below. It was a desperate, clumsy maneuver that nearly capsized their small vessel, but somehow they managed to get everyone safely inside. Margaret collapsed in the bottom of the boat next to the 2 boys, all 3 of them breathing heavily and shivering from cold and exhaustion. The younger child was still unconscious, his lips blue and his breathing shallow. The older boy was conscious but clearly suffering from exposure and shock. They were all alive, but they weren't safe yet. They still had to make it back to shore through the treacherous current. Margaret forced herself to sit up and take hold of the oars again. Her arms felt like lead weights, and her hands were so cold she could barely maintain her grip, but giving up now would mean that all their efforts had been for nothing. She began rowing toward shore, fighting against the current and the constant threat of debris that could hold their small boat at any moment. The trip back seemed to take hours, though it was probably only minutes. Margaret's world had narrowed to the simple rhythm of pulling at the oars, checking on the boys, and scanning the water ahead for obstacles. The older child had positioned himself next to his unconscious companion, speaking softly in Lakota and rubbing the younger boy's hands in an attempt to restore circulation. When they finally reached the shallows near Margaret's property, she was too exhausted to beach the boat properly. Instead, she simply aimed it toward the muddy bank and let momentum carry them as far as possible before jumping out and dragging the boat the rest of the way onto solid ground. The older boy tried to help, but his own strength was nearly depleted. Together, they managed to carry the unconscious child toward Margaret's farmhouse, taking turns supporting his weight and stopping frequently to rest. The rain was beginning to ease, but all three of them were soaked to the skin and shivering violently. Margaret knew that getting them warm and dry was now the most important priority. Hypothermia could kill just as surely as drowning, and they weren't out of danger yet. Once inside her kitchen, Margaret quickly built up the fire in her wood stove and began heating water for warm baths. She found old quilts and blankets, wrapping the boys while she prepared hot soup and strong coffee. The older child remained conscious and alert, though he spoke little English beyond "thank you," repeated over and over in a voice hoarse from shouting and exposure. The younger boy remained unconscious for nearly an hour, his breathing shallow and his skin pale and cold. Margaret did everything she knew to do, warming him gradually, checking his breathing, speaking softly to him even though he couldn't hear her words. She had no medical training beyond the basic first aid that farm life required, but she had a mother's instincts and a determination to see these children through to safety. When the younger boy finally opened his eyes, Margaret felt tears of relief streaming down her own cheeks. He looked around in confusion, speaking rapidly in Lakota until his older companion explained what had happened. Then both boys looked at Margaret with expressions of gratitude and wonder that transcended any language barriers. As the evening wore on and the boys recovered their strength, Margaret began to wonder about their family. Someone would be looking for them, worried sick about their welfare. The reservation was a close-knit community, and the disappearance of 2 children would not go unnoticed. But with the flood still raging and many roads impassable, it might be days before word could be sent or received. Margaret decided to keep the boys with her until it was safe to travel and until she could find a way to contact their family. She prepared beds for them in her spare room, giving them some of her late husband's old clothes to wear while their own things dried by the fire. The boys accepted her hospitality with quiet dignity, clearly raised to be polite and respectful even in difficult circumstances. As she tucked them into bed that night, Margaret reflected on the strange turns that life could take. 24 hours earlier, she had been living in the same routine that had defined her existence for the past 5 years, tending her small farm, mourning her husband's absence, and maintaining polite but distant relationships with her neighbors. Now, she found herself caring for 2 children from a community she barely knew, connected to them by bonds forged in crisis and mutual dependence. The boys spoke quietly to each other in Lakota before settling down to sleep, their voices carrying the comfort that comes from shared experience and survival. Margaret listened from the kitchen as their conversation gradually died away, replaced by the deep breathing of exhausted children finally able to rest in safety. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, though the flooding would continue for several more days as the river gradually returned to its normal banks. Margaret sat by her kitchen window, watching the water slowly recede and thinking about the day's events. She had risked everything to save 2 children she had never met before, acting on instincts she hadn't known she possessed. In doing so, she had discovered something about herself. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. She had also discovered that the barriers between communities were often more fragile than they appeared, capable of being swept away as easily as houses and fences when more fundamental human needs demanded attention. Margaret didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew that saving those boys had changed something essential in her understanding of who she was and what she was capable of doing. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, connected to something larger than her own grief and solitude. The flood would eventually recede, the damage would be repaired, and life would return to something resembling normal. But Margaret Thompson would never again be quite the same woman who had stood on her porch that morning, watching debris float past and thinking only of her own safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she tried to reunite the boys with their family and deal with the aftermath of the rescue. But tonight, it was enough to know that 2 young lives had been saved, that courage had triumphed over fear, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply refuse to turn away when someone needed help. Margaret woke before dawn, as had become her habit since Robert's death. But this morning felt different from the countless others that had preceded it. Soft voices drifted from the spare bedroom, speaking in the musical cadences of Lakota that she was beginning to find strangely comforting. The boys were awake, probably discussing their situation in the practical way that children often did, accepting circumstances that would leave adults paralyzed with uncertainty. She rose quietly and made her way to the kitchen, where the previous day's event seemed almost like a dream. Muddy Boots sat by the door, Robert's old clothes hung drying by the stove, and a pair of small moccasins were arranged carefully on the windowsill. The evidence was undeniable. She had indeed rescued 2 Sioux children from the flood, and now they were her responsibility until she could find a way to return them safely to their family. Margaret built up the fire and started breakfast, making extra portions of everything she prepared. The boys would need good food to complete their recovery from yesterday's ordeal, and she found herself wanting to provide more than just basic sustenance. She fried eggs, thick slices of ham, and potatoes, filling the kitchen with aromas that reminded her of Sunday mornings when Robert was still alive, and the future seemed full of possibilities. The older boy appeared in the kitchen doorway first, dressed in Robert's old shirt which hung nearly to his knees. He had rolled up the sleeves multiple times, but the effect was still comical. Despite the oversized clothing, he carried himself with a dignity that impressed Margaret. He stood straight and looked directly at her when he spoke, meeting her eyes without the shyness she might have expected from a child in such circumstances. "Thank you," he said carefully, his English heavily accented but clearly understandable. "Thank you for helping us." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What's your name, son?" "I am Joseph," he replied, then gestured toward the bedroom. "My brother is Daniel, he is still sleeping." "Joseph," Margaret repeated, testing the name. It seemed to fit the serious, responsible boy who had helped pull his unconscious brother into the boat. "That's a good name. Are you hungry, Joseph?" The boy nodded, though she could tell he was trying not to seem too eager. Margaret suspected it had been a long time since his last proper meal, even before yesterday's crisis. She filled a plate with food and set it on the table, gesturing for him to sit. Joseph hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto one of her kitchen chairs and began eating with careful, measured bites. As she watched him eat, Margaret found herself studying his face and trying to guess his age. He seemed older than his years, carrying himself with the gravity of someone who had shouldered responsibilities beyond his chronological development. His dark hair was still damp from the washing she had given both boys the night before, and his brown eyes held an alertness that suggested intelligence and careful observation of everything around him. "Where do you live, Joseph?" she asked gently. "Your family will be worried about you." The boy paused in his eating and looked out the window toward the still-swollen river. "On the reservation, past the big water near the sacred hill." He struggled with some of the English words, but his meaning was clear enough. "My grandmother will be very scared. She thinks the flood spirits have taken us." Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for the unknown grandmother who was probably spending sleepless nights wondering what had become of her grandsons. "We'll find a way to let her know you're safe," she promised. "As soon as the water goes down and the roads are clear, we'll get you home." Joseph nodded and returned to his breakfast, but Margaret could see the worry in his eyes. Time moved differently for children than for adults, and a few days separated from family could feel like an eternity. She began thinking about possible ways to get word to the reservation, though the flooding had made most of the usual routes impassable. The younger boy, Daniel, appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. He was smaller than his brother, with the round face and large eyes that made him seem even younger than his years. Unlike Joseph's serious demeanor, Daniel seemed more openly curious about his surroundings, taking in the details of Margaret's kitchen with the frank interest of a child encountering something entirely new. Margaret prepared another plate and welcomed Daniel to the table. The younger boy was less fluent in English than his brother, speaking mostly in Lakota and relying on Joseph to translate. But his smile was universal, and he seemed to understand Margaret's kindness even when he couldn't follow her words. "He says the food is very good," Joseph translated after a rapid exchange between the brothers. "He wants to know if you are an angel." Margaret laughed, the first genuine laughter she had produced in months. "Tell him I'm just a woman who happened to be in the right place at the right time." Joseph spoke to his brother in Lakota, but Daniel shook his head and replied emphatically. Joseph looked a little embarrassed as he translated. "He says angels are always in the right place at the right time. That's what makes them angels." The simple wisdom of the observation caught Margaret off guard. She had never thought of herself in such terms, but from the perspective of a child who had been drowning in a flood, perhaps the distinction between divine intervention and human kindness was less important than the fact of salvation itself. After breakfast, Margaret found tasks to occupy the boys while she considered their situation more carefully. The flood was beginning to recede, but slowly, and many roads remained impassable. Even if she could somehow travel to the reservation, she wasn't certain she would be welcome there. The relationship between the white community and the Sioux had been strained for decades, marked by misunderstanding and mutual suspicion. Joseph seemed to understand her dilemma without it being explained to him. "There is a trading post," he said as they stood on the front porch, watching the floodwaters slowly retreat across the valley. "Mr. Blackhorse goes there sometimes to sell beadwork and buy supplies. The white man who runs it knows some of our language." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. She knew the trading post Joseph was referring to, a small establishment about 10 miles south of town that served as one of the few commercial bridges between the reservation and the white community. If anyone could help her get word to the boy's family, it would be the trader who had built his business on cross-cultural communication and mutual respect. But 10 miles was still a considerable distance, especially with the roads in their current condition. Margaret's wagon was sturdy, but she wasn't sure it could handle the mud and debris that the flood had left behind. Still, it seemed like their best option for making contact with the boy's family. As they stood watching the water, a movement in the distance caught Margaret's attention. A rider was picking his way carefully across the flooded valley, his horse stepping cautiously around debris and searching for solid footing. As he drew closer, Margaret could see it was Tom Bradley, one of the volunteer firefighters who had been helping with flood rescue efforts. Tom guided his horse up the slope toward Margaret's farmhouse, his face showing the exhaustion of several days spent in emergency response. When he dismounted near the porch, his eyes immediately focused on the two Sioux boys standing beside Margaret. "Afternoon, Margaret," he said politely, though she could hear the curiosity in his voice. "Glad to see you made it through the flood all right. Are these boys?" "I pulled them out of the water yesterday," Margaret explained simply. "They were caught in the flood, and I was able to get them to safety." Tom nodded slowly, processing this information. Margaret could see him taking in the details, the boys' obvious Native American heritage, their comfortable presence at her home, the protective way she stood near them. "That was brave of you," he said finally. "Dangerous, too. That water was moving fast enough to kill a grown man." "Sometimes you don't have time to think about danger," Margaret replied. "You just do what needs to be done." Tom studied the boys for a moment, then looked back at Margaret. "Their people will be looking for them. The sheriff sent word to the reservation yesterday, but the response team has been stretched thin. A lot of folks caught in this flood on both sides of the river." Joseph stepped forward and spoke directly to Tom, his English careful but clear. "We are Joseph and Daniel Crow Feather. Our grandmother is Mary Crow Feather. She will be very worried." Tom nodded and pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket. "Crow Feather," he repeated, writing down the name. "I can get word to the sheriff, and he can make sure the right people know where you are." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was glad that steps were being taken to reunite the boys with their family, but she was also beginning to realize how much their presence had affected her. For the first time in years, her house felt like a home again, filled with the sounds of young voices and the energy that children brought to any space they occupied. "How long do you think it will take?" she asked. "Hard to say," Tom replied honestly. "Depends on how much damage the reservation took and how quickly we can get messages through. Could be a few days, maybe longer. You okay keeping them here until then?" Margaret looked at the two boys, who were watching the conversation with the patient attention of children accustomed to adult discussions that affected their fate. "They're welcome to stay as long as necessary," she said firmly. Tom mounted his horse and prepared to leave, but paused before heading back down the slope. "Margaret," he said quietly, "what you did was something special. Not many people would have risked their lives for children they didn't even know." After Tom rode away, Margaret found herself alone with Joseph and Daniel, facing the prospect of several more days together. She had thought of them primarily as a temporary responsibility, but now she began to consider what it would mean to actually care for them during an extended stay. The boys seemed to sense her uncertainty, and Joseph approached her with the serious expression she was beginning to recognize as his default demeanor. "We do not want to be trouble," he said carefully. "We can help with work. Daniel and I know how to do many things." Margaret felt her heart soften even further. "You're not trouble, Joseph, but I would appreciate any help you can give." Over the next several hours, she discovered that the boys were indeed capable of useful work. Joseph proved skilled at feeding chickens and gathering eggs, while Daniel showed surprising aptitude for organizing firewood and tidying up around the farmhouse. Both boys worked with a quiet efficiency that suggested they were accustomed to contributing to household tasks. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to see glimpses of their individual personalities beyond the crisis that had brought them together. Joseph was serious and responsible, but he also had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable. Daniel was more playful and curious, asking questions about everything from the mechanical clock on Margaret's mantelpiece to the photographs of Robert that sat on various tables around the house. When Daniel pointed to one of the photographs and spoke in Lakota, Joseph translated his question. "He wants to know if the man in the picture is your husband." Margaret nodded, picking up the frame that held her favorite photograph of Robert. "His name was Robert. He died in the war 5 years ago." Joseph translated for his brother, and both boys grew quiet for a moment. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice soft and sympathetic. "He says he is sorry," Joseph translated. "He says losing family is the hardest thing in the world." The simple compassion in the statement caught Margaret by surprise. She had grown accustomed to the polite condolences of neighbors and the awkward silences that often followed mentions of Robert's death. But these children, despite their own recent trauma, were able to offer genuine sympathy without any of the discomfort that usually accompanied such expressions. "Tell him thank you," Margaret said quietly. "Tell him that having you both here has made me feel less alone." As evening approached, Margaret began preparing dinner, and the boys continued to help in whatever ways they could. Joseph proved surprisingly knowledgeable about cooking, able to identify herbs and spices and offer suggestions about seasoning and preparation. Daniel was more interested in setting the table and arranging things in pleasing patterns. During dinner, the conversation ranged over a variety of topics. Joseph told Margaret about their life on the reservation, describing their grandmother's house and the school they attended where they learned both English and traditional Lakota ways. Daniel, with Joseph translating, shared stories about their grandfather, who had been a respected storyteller before his death the previous winter. Margaret found herself sharing memories of Robert and their life together, describing the farm's history and the changes she had witnessed in the valley over the years. It was the first time in a long while that she had talked about her husband without feeling overwhelmed by sadness, and she realized that the boy's presence was helping her remember the joy that had also been part of her marriage. After dinner, they gathered in the living room where Margaret had built a fire in the stone fireplace. The boys sat on the floor near the hearth, and Daniel asked Joseph to tell a story. Joseph looked at Margaret questioningly, and she nodded her encouragement. What followed was a traditional Lakota tale about a great flood and the animals who worked together to save their world. Joseph told the story in English for Margaret's benefit, but his rhythm and cadence carried the musicality of oral tradition. Daniel occasionally interjected with details or corrections, and Margaret found herself drawn into the narrative despite its unfamiliar cultural context. The story spoke of courage and sacrifice, of the importance of helping others even when doing so required great personal risk. As Joseph reached the climax of the tale, Margaret realized that the boys had chosen this particular story deliberately, as a way of honoring what she had done for them while placing it within their own cultural framework of understanding. When the story was finished, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Margaret felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completeness that had been missing from her life since Robert's death. These boys had brought more than their physical presence to her home. They had brought purpose, connection, and a reminder that family could take many different forms. "Margaret," Joseph said quietly, using her first name for the first time, "will you tell us a story from your people?" She thought for a moment, then began telling them about Johnny Appleseed, the man who had traveled across America planting apple trees and spreading kindness wherever he went. As she spoke, she watched the boys' faces in the firelight and realized that stories were indeed universal, carrying wisdom and comfort across cultural boundaries and connecting people in ways that ordinary conversation could not achieve. When it came time for bed, both boys hugged her goodnight, a gesture that felt natural despite the cultural differences that might have made such intimacy awkward under other circumstances. Margaret tucked them into their beds and listened once again to their quiet conversation in Lakota before sleep claimed them. Standing in her own bedroom later, looking out at the still-swollen river that had brought these children into her life, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her world had changed in just 2 days. She had begun this experience thinking only of rescue and temporary care, but she was beginning to understand that the relationship developing between them was something more profound and lasting. The boys would eventually return to their family, and her house would become quiet again. But something fundamental had shifted in Margaret's understanding of herself and her place in the world. She had discovered reserves of courage and compassion she hadn't known she possessed, and more importantly, she had been reminded of the deep human need for connection and care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they waited for word from the reservation and continued to navigate their unusual circumstances. But tonight, Margaret fell asleep with a sense of contentment she had almost forgotten was possible, knowing that whatever the future brought, she had been given a precious gift in these days of unexpected family. The third day began with unexpected visitors. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind her house, with Joseph and Daniel helping to carry wet clothes from the kitchen, when the sound of horses approaching caused all 3 of them to look up. 3 riders were making their way carefully across the muddy ground that separated Margaret's farmhouse from the main road. As they drew closer, Margaret could see that 2 of the riders were white men she recognized, Sheriff Williams and his deputy, Mark Stevens. The 3rd rider was a Native American man she had never seen before, though his dignified bearing and the respectful way the other 2 men deferred to him suggested he was someone of considerable importance within his community. Joseph and Daniel immediately recognized the 3rd rider, and their faces lit up with excitement and relief. Joseph called out in Lakota, and the man responded in the same language, his voice carrying warmth and obvious affection. Margaret didn't need a translation to understand that this was someone very significant in the boys' lives. "That's our uncle," Joseph explained quickly to Margaret. "Samuel Crow Feather. He is our grandmother's son and a member of the tribal council." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with nervousness. She had imagined this moment, the arrival of the boys' family, but she hadn't anticipated feeling so anxious about it. Would they be grateful for her care, or would they be suspicious of her motives? Would they think she had somehow taken advantage of the situation, or that her rescue had been motivated by something other than simple human compassion? The 3 riders dismounted near the front porch, and Sheriff Williams stepped forward to make introductions. "Margaret, this is Samuel Crow Feather. He's come to collect his nephews and to thank you personally for what you've done." Samuel Crow Feather was a man of perhaps 40 years, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. He wore a mixture of traditional and modern clothing, denim pants and work boots, but also a beautifully beaded vest and a silver bracelet that caught the morning light. When he spoke, his English was precise and unaccented, suggesting formal education as well as natural intelligence. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, extending his hand in greeting, "I cannot adequately express my family's gratitude for what you have done. You risked your own life to save my nephews, and you have cared for them with kindness when you had no obligation to do so." Margaret shook his hand, feeling some of her nervousness ease at his warm and direct manner. "I did what anyone would have done in the same circumstances," she replied. "Joseph and Daniel are wonderful boys. They've been no trouble at all." Samuel smiled at this, glancing toward his nephews who were hanging back politely but clearly eager to greet their uncle properly. "May I speak with them for a moment?" Margaret nodded, and Samuel knelt down to embrace both boys, speaking rapidly in Lakota while they responded with equal enthusiasm. The reunion was emotional but controlled, reflecting the dignified restraint that seemed to characterize this family's approach to strong feelings. After several minutes of conversation, Samuel stood and turned back to Margaret. "They have told me many things about your kindness," he said. "Joseph says you shared your food, your home, and your stories. Daniel says you are like the grandmother spirits who watch over lost children." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the simple eloquence of the boys' observations. "They've given me as much as I've given them," she said honestly. maybe more. Sheriff Williams shifted uncomfortably, clearly anxious to complete his official duties and move on to other responsibilities. Well, now that everyone's been reunited, I suppose we can consider this matter settled, he said briskly. But Samuel raised a hand to pause the sheriff's departure. If it is acceptable to Mrs. Thompson, I would like to spend some time here before we return to the reservation. My mother, the boy's grandmother, has asked me to learn everything I can about what happened and about the woman who saved her grandsons. Margaret felt a flutter of surprise. She had expected the reunion to be brief and formal, followed by a quick departure. The prospect of an extended visit created both anticipation and anxiety. "Of course," she said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like." Sheriff Williams looked less pleased with this development. Margaret could see him calculating the potential complications of an extended interaction between white and Native American families, especially given the tensions that periodically surfaced in their community. But Samuel's dignity and obvious education made it difficult for the sheriff to raise any direct objections. "I'll leave you folks to get acquainted," Sheriff Williams said finally. "If you need anything, just send word." After the sheriff and his deputy departed, Margaret found herself alone with Samuel and the two boys, facing a situation she had never experienced before. She had no idea what was expected of her or what protocols might govern such an interaction. Samuel seemed to sense her uncertainty and addressed it directly. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope my request to stay does not impose upon your hospitality," he said. "In our culture, when someone saves the life of a family member, it creates obligations and relationships that must be properly acknowledged. My mother has sent me to understand what those relationships should be." Margaret was intrigued by the concept of formal obligations arising from her rescue of the boys, though she wasn't sure what such obligations might entail. "I'm not familiar with your customs," she admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." Samuel smiled approvingly at her response. "Learning is the beginning of wisdom," he said. "Perhaps we can teach each other many things." Over the course of the morning, Margaret found herself engaged in conversations that ranged far beyond the immediate circumstances of the rescue. Samuel was clearly an educated and well-traveled man, familiar with both Native American and white American culture in ways that allowed him to serve as a bridge between the two communities. He told her about the reservation's struggles with poverty and disease, but also about its rich cultural traditions and the ways in which the Sioux people were adapting to changing circumstances while preserving their essential identity. Margaret found herself sharing her own experiences of loss and isolation, describing the challenges of maintaining a farm alone and the way that grief had gradually separated her from her community. Joseph and Daniel listened to these conversations with the patient attention of children accustomed to adult discussions that would shape their own futures. Occasionally, they would add their own perspectives or ask questions that revealed their growing understanding of the complex world they were inheriting. As the day progressed, Samuel began to reveal more about his mother's specific requests and expectations. "She has asked me to invite you to visit our home," he said during their afternoon meal. "She wants to meet the woman who saved her grandsons and to offer proper thanks according to our traditions." Margaret felt both honored and intimidated by the invitation. "I would be grateful for the opportunity to meet her," she said carefully, "but I want to be respectful of your customs. I wouldn't want to do anything inappropriate." "Your willingness to learn shows respect," Samuel replied. "The specific forms matter less than the spirit behind them." During the evening, Samuel shared more stories about Lakota traditions and history, while Margaret contributed her own family stories and her knowledge of local pioneer history. Joseph and Daniel served as enthusiastic participants in these exchanges, occasionally correcting details or adding information that the adults had overlooked. Margaret began to understand that this extended visit was serving multiple purposes beyond simple gratitude. Samuel was assessing her character and motivations, determining whether the relationship between their families could develop into something deeper and more lasting than a single act of rescue and its immediate aftermath. "In our tradition," Samuel explained as they sat around the fire that evening, "when someone saves a life, they become connected to that person's family in ways that can last for generations. It is not just a debt to be repaid, but a bond to be honored and maintained." Margaret found herself deeply moved by this concept. Her own culture emphasized individual achievement and self-reliance, making it difficult to imagine the kind of extended family networks that Samuel was describing. But the idea appealed to her, especially given her own isolation and the sense of connection she had developed with the boys. "What would such a bond mean in practical terms?" she asked. Samuel considered the question carefully before responding. "It would mean that our families would be connected as relatives, with all the obligations and privileges that such relationships entail. You would have a voice in decisions affecting the boys' welfare, and they would have a place in your family as well. It would mean sharing resources when one family faced difficulties and celebrating together during times of joy." The concept was both foreign and appealing to Margaret. She had lived independently for so long that the idea of accepting help from others felt uncomfortable, but she was beginning to understand how much the boys' presence had enriched her life. The prospect of maintaining that connection, of becoming part of an extended family network, offered possibilities she had never seriously considered. "What does your mother expect from me?" Margaret asked. "I want to be honest about what I can and cannot offer." "She expects nothing more than what you have already given," Samuel replied. "Courage when it was needed, kindness when it was appropriate, and openness to understanding what has developed between our families." That night, as Margaret prepared for sleep, she reflected on the dramatic changes that had occurred in her life over the past few days. She had begun the week as an isolated widow, maintaining minimal contact with her community and viewing her future as an endless repetition of solitary routines. Now she was contemplating formal kinship relationships with a Native American family, considering possibilities that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. The next morning brought new developments. Samuel announced that he would be returning to the reservation that afternoon, but that he hoped Margaret would accompany him for a visit with his mother. "She is elderly and cannot travel easily," he explained, "but she is very eager to meet you." Margaret felt nervous about venturing onto the reservation, knowing that her presence there would be unusual and potentially controversial. But her desire to meet the boys' grandmother and to understand more about their culture outweighed her apprehensions. "I would be honored to visit your mother," she said. "When would be convenient?" "Today, if you are willing," Samuel replied. "The boys can remain here if you prefer, or they can come with us to help with introductions and translation." Joseph and Daniel were enthusiastic about the prospect of accompanying Margaret to the reservation, and their excitement helped ease her remaining nervousness. If the boys were comfortable with the arrangement, she reasoned, then she should be as well. The journey to the reservation took nearly 3 hours, traveling by wagon over roads that were still muddy and treacherous from the recent flooding. Samuel rode alongside the wagon, pointing out landmarks and explaining the history of various locations they passed. Margaret found herself fascinated by his knowledge of local geography and the stories he told about interactions between Native American and white communities over the previous decades. As they approached the reservation, Margaret began to see signs of the different world they were entering. The houses were smaller and more simply constructed than those in town, but they were well-maintained and showed evidence of pride and care. Children played in yards while women worked at various tasks, and men gathered in small groups to discuss community business. Samuel's mother lived in a modest frame house near the center of the reservation, surrounded by a carefully tended garden and several outbuildings. Mary Crow Feather was a small, elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated wisdom. When Samuel introduced Margaret, the older woman studied her carefully for several moments before speaking in Lakota. Joseph translated his grandmother's words. "She says you have the face of someone who understands sorrow but has not let it make her bitter." Margaret felt deeply moved by the observation and its accuracy. "Tell her I'm honored to meet her and grateful for her family's kindness." What followed was one of the most meaningful conversations Margaret had ever experienced. Despite the language barrier, Mary Crow Feather spoke limited English, and Margaret spoke no Lakota. The two women managed to communicate through a combination of translation by Joseph and Samuel, gestures, and the kind of intuitive understanding that sometimes develops between people who have shared similar experiences. Mary Crow Feather had lost her own husband in an accident several years earlier, and she understood the particular kind of loneliness that came from losing one's life partner. She also understood the joy of having children around to break the silence and provide purpose to daily routines. Without directly saying so, She conveyed her recognition that Margaret had been deeply affected by caring for her grandsons and that the relationship had been mutually beneficial. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret was introduced to other members of the extended family and community. She met cousins, aunts, and neighbors, each of whom seemed genuinely interested in meeting the woman who had rescued Joseph and Daniel. The warmth of their reception surprised her, given the tensions she knew existed between white and Native American communities. Samuel later explained that her actions had earned her a kind of respect that transcended cultural boundaries. "Courage is valued in our culture above almost everything else," he said. "When someone risks their own life for children who are not their own, it demonstrates the kind of character that we honor regardless of race or background." During the visit, Margaret also learned more about the boys' family situation. Their parents had died in a tuberculosis outbreak 2 years earlier, leaving them in the care of their grandmother and the extended family network that Samuel had described. The loss had been devastating for the entire community, but particularly for Mary Crow Feather, who had already buried her husband and now found herself responsible for raising her grandsons alone. "She sees your rescue of the boys as a sign," Samuel explained as they prepared to depart. "In our beliefs, when someone appears at the right moment to provide help, it is not considered coincidence, but rather evidence of spiritual intervention." Margaret didn't know how to respond to such an interpretation of her actions, but she found herself moved by the idea that her spontaneous decision to help could be viewed as part of a larger spiritual pattern. Whether or not she shared those beliefs, she could appreciate the comfort they provided to people dealing with loss and uncertainty. As they prepared to leave the reservation, Mary Crow Feather pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. Through Samuel's translation, she made a formal request. Would Margaret consider allowing Joseph and Daniel to visit her regularly, perhaps spending weekends or school holidays at the farmhouse? The boys had spoken enthusiastically about their time with her, and she believed such visits would benefit everyone involved. Margaret was deeply honored by the request, but also somewhat overwhelmed by its implications. Regular visits would formalize the relationship between their families in ways that would be noticed and commented upon by both communities. She would be taking on responsibilities for the boys' welfare that went beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together. But as she looked at Joseph and Daniel, both of whom were watching her with hopeful expressions, Margaret realized that her answer had been predetermined by the affection that had already developed between them. "I would love to have them visit," she said simply. Mary Crow Feather smiled and spoke again in Lakota, her words carrying obvious pleasure and satisfaction. "She says the spirits have made a good choice," Samuel translated. The journey back to Margaret's farmhouse was filled with excited chatter from the boys, who were clearly pleased with the day's developments. They talked about showing Margaret more of the reservation during future visits, teaching her Lakota words, and sharing more stories from their family's traditions. As evening approached and they reached the farmhouse, Margaret reflected on how much her world had expanded in just one day. She had entered a community she had never seriously considered visiting, met people who had welcomed her with surprising warmth, and committed herself to ongoing relationships that would reshape her future in fundamental ways. That night, as she tucked the boys into bed for what she knew would be their last night in her house for a while, Margaret felt both sadness and anticipation. The temporary crisis that had brought them together was ending, but it was being replaced by something deeper and more lasting, a chosen family relationship that would provide all of them with connections they had been missing. "When will we see you again?" Daniel asked through Joseph's translation. "Very soon," Margaret promised, realizing as she spoke the words how much she was already looking forward to their next visit. 3 months had passed since the Great Flood, and Margaret's life had taken on rhythms she could never have imagined. Every other weekend, Joseph and Daniel would arrive at her farmhouse, usually accompanied by Samuel or another family member who would stay for a meal before departing. The visits had become the highlights of Margaret's weeks, filling her home with laughter, conversation, and the kind of purposeful activity that she had missed since Robert's death. The boys were thriving in this arrangement. Joseph had grown noticeably taller and more confident, his English improving with each visit as he became more comfortable expressing complex thoughts and emotions in Margaret's language. Daniel remained more reserved with his English, but his personality had blossomed in other ways. He had become fascinated with Margaret's collection of books and would spend hours looking at pictures and asking questions about the stories they contained. Margaret had also begun making regular visits to the reservation, usually accompanying the boys when they returned home and staying for community meals or celebrations. These visits had gradually introduced her to the wider world of Lakota culture, from traditional ceremonies to contemporary challenges facing the community. She had been surprised by the warmth of her reception and the ease with which she had been accepted into social gatherings. But it was during the Harvest Festival in late September that Margaret received an honor that would change her relationship with the Crow Feather family forever. The festival was the largest community gathering Margaret had attended on the reservation. Families had come from hundreds of miles away to participate in traditional dances, share food, and celebrate the year's harvest. Margaret had been invited by Mary Crow Feather to attend as a family guest, and she had spent considerable time preparing appropriate gifts and learning about the protocols that would govern her participation. Samuel had explained that the Harvest Festival was also a time when the community recognized individuals who had made significant contributions to the welfare of tribal members. Awards were given for various forms of service, from helping with farming to teaching traditional crafts. But the highest honor was reserved for those who had demonstrated exceptional courage in protecting the lives of community members. Margaret had not expected to be directly involved in these recognition ceremonies. She assumed she would observe respectfully from the sidelines, learning about traditions that had been practiced for generations before her arrival. But as the formal presentations began, Samuel rose from his seat and called her name. "Margaret Thompson," he announced in both English and Lakota, "please come forward." Margaret felt her heart begin to race as she looked around at the gathered community members, all of whom were now focused on her. Joseph and Daniel, sitting nearby with their grandmother, gestured encouragingly for her to stand. With legs that felt suddenly unsteady, Margaret made her way to the center of the gathering where Samuel was waiting with several tribal elders. What followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Samuel began to speak in Lakota, his voice carrying the formal cadences of ceremonial address. Though she could not understand most of his words, Margaret could hear the gravity and respect in his tone. Joseph appeared at her side to provide translation as Samuel recounted the story of her rescue of the two boys, but his version was more detailed and dramatic than Margaret's own memories of the event. According to Samuel's telling, Margaret had risked her life in raging floodwaters to save two children she had never met, demonstrating the kind of selfless courage that was most valued in Lakota tradition. She had then cared for the boys with the devotion of a mother, sharing her home and food without thought of compensation or recognition. Most importantly, she had opened her heart and mind to learning about their culture, showing the wisdom and humility that were prerequisites for true kinship. As Samuel concluded his formal remarks, Mary Crow Feather rose from her place among the elders and approached Margaret carrying a beautiful star quilt. The quilt was clearly a work of considerable artistry, with intricate patterns worked in traditional colors and designs that Margaret had learned to recognize during her visits to the reservation. Mary Crow Feather spoke directly to Margaret, and this time Samuel provided immediate translation. "She says this quilt was made by the women of our family to honor your courage and kindness. It carries the prayers and gratitude of all who love Joseph and Daniel." Margaret accepted the quilt with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the honor being bestowed upon her. But Mary Crow Feather was not finished. She spoke again, and this time her words caused a murmur of surprise and approval throughout the gathering. "She is offering you formal adoption into our family," Samuel translated, his own voice showing emotion. "She is asking if you will accept the role of sister to her late son, the father of Joseph and Daniel, which would make you their aunt in our kinship system." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the magnitude of what was being offered. This was not simply recognition of her rescue efforts, but an invitation to become permanently part of their family structure with all the rights and responsibilities that such membership entailed. The entire gathering had fallen silent, waiting for her response. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, the Crow Feather family who had already welcomed her so warmly, the community members who were witnessing this rare ceremony, and especially Joseph and Daniel, whose eyes shone with hope and excitement. "I am deeply honored," Margaret said, her voice barely steady enough to carry her words. "I accept with gratitude and humility." The response from the gathering was immediate and enthusiastic. People began singing and drumming, while family members came forward to embrace Margaret and welcome her officially into their kinship network. The ceremony continued for several hours, with additional speeches, traditional songs, and the sharing of food that sealed the new relationships. But the most moving moment came when an elderly man whom Margaret had met several times during previous visits approached her with a small leather pouch. Samuel introduced him as Robert Crow Feather, the oldest living member of their clan and a veteran of conflicts that stretched back to the Indian Wars of the previous century. Robert Crow Feather spoke quietly to Samuel, who nodded gravely before turning to Margaret. "He wants to give you something that has been in our family for many generations," Samuel explained. "It is a medicine bundle that belonged to his grandfather, a holy man who was known for his wisdom and healing powers." Margaret tried to protest that such a precious gift was far too valuable for her to accept, but Robert Crow Feather gently placed the pouch in her hands while speaking firmly in Lakota. "He says the medicine chooses its own keeper," Samuel translated. "He believes the spirits guided you to save Joseph and Daniel because you were meant to become part of our family. The medicine bundle is confirmation of that spiritual calling." Margaret accepted the gift with reverence, understanding instinctively that she was being entrusted with something far more significant than a simple family heirloom. The leather pouch was soft with age and handling, and she could feel small objects inside that she did not presume to examine. Robert Crow Feather explained through Samuel that the bundle contained sacred items that had been blessed by generations of holy men and women, and that it was meant to provide protection and guidance to its keeper. The ceremony concluded with Margaret being given a new name in Lakota, Wikeuha Waste, which Samuel translated as Good Helper Woman. The name would be used in formal contexts to acknowledge her status within the family and community, though she would continue to be known as Margaret in everyday interactions. As the evening wound down and families began to prepare for departure, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and new relatives who wanted to express their approval of the adoption and share their own stories of family connections. She was invited to future ceremonies, asked to participate in women's activities, and generally welcomed into the complex social network that defined reservation life. Joseph and Daniel had remained close to her throughout the evening, clearly proud of their role in bringing about this new family arrangement. As they helped her carefully pack the star quilt and medicine bundle for transport back to her farmhouse, both boys expressed their excitement about the permanence of their relationship. "Now you are really our aunt," Joseph said with obvious satisfaction. "Not just someone who helped us, but family forever." Daniel, speaking through Joseph's translation, added his own perspective. "He says now our grandmother won't worry about us so much when we visit you. She knows that family takes care of family." The journey back to Margaret's farmhouse that night was filled with reflection on the day's events and discussion of what the new relationship would mean for all of them. Samuel explained some of the practical implications of Margaret's adoption into the family. She would be consulted about important decisions affecting the boys' welfare, invited to participate in family councils, and expected to contribute to the community's welfare according to her abilities and resources. "It is not just an honor," Samuel emphasized. "It is also a responsibility. You are now accountable to the family and the community for your actions and decisions." Margaret understood that she was taking on obligations that extended far beyond her relationship with Joseph and Daniel, though they remained at the center of her commitment. She was now part of a network of mutual support and shared responsibility that operated according to principles she was still learning to understand. Over the following weeks, Margaret began to experience the practical effects of her new family status. She received visits from women in the community who wanted to teach her traditional crafts and include her in their regular gathering circles. Men came to help with farm work that was too difficult for her to manage alone, refusing payment, but accepting meals and friendship in return. Most significantly, she began to understand how her relationship with Joseph and Daniel fit into the larger context of their community's approach to child-rearing. The boys were not just the responsibility of their immediate family, but of the entire extended kinship network that now included her. Their education, welfare, and development were shared concerns that required input and support from many adults. Margaret found herself participating in discussions about the boys' schooling, their participation in traditional activities, and their preparation for adult responsibilities. She was consulted when Joseph expressed interest in learning to work with horses, and when Daniel showed unusual aptitude for drawing and artistic expression. These new responsibilities were both challenging and deeply satisfying. Margaret had to learn new ways of making decisions collectively rather than independently, and she had to become comfortable with expressing opinions about matters that affected people she was still getting to know. But she also experienced the security and support that came from being part of a community that was genuinely committed to the welfare of all its members. The star quilt that Mary Crow Feather had given her now held a place of honor on Margaret's bed, reminding her daily of her new status and responsibilities. The medicine bundle rested on her mantelpiece next to photographs of Robert, creating a visual representation of the way her old life and new relationships had merged into something larger than either could have been alone. As autumn progressed toward winter, Margaret began preparing for her first Christmas as a member of the Crow Feather family. The boys would spend the holiday with her, and several family members had been invited to share in the celebration. Margaret was learning to blend her own traditions with those of her new family, creating hybrid celebrations that honored both cultures while building new traditions for the future. The plans for Christmas also highlighted how much her relationship with the broader community had changed since the flood. Where she had once faced the holiday with dread and loneliness, she now anticipated it with excitement and joy. Her house would be full of laughter and conversation, her table surrounded by people who had chosen to be family to each other. But even as Margaret embraced her new life, she sometimes found herself amazed by the path that had brought her to this point. A single act of courage during a natural disaster had led to relationships and responsibilities she could never have imagined when she first spotted two boys clinging to an oak tree in the floodwaters. The rescue had taken only a few hours, but its consequences were reshaping not just her own life, but the lives of everyone connected to her new family. Margaret was beginning to understand that some actions create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances, touching people and communities in ways that can only be fully appreciated with the passage of time. The Crow Feather Boys had become legendary in both the white community of Cedar Falls and on the Sioux Reservation. But for Margaret herself, the legend mattered less than the daily reality of her transformed life as aunt, teacher, advocate, and bridge between two worlds that had learned to see each other with new eyes. Joseph was now 15, tall and serious like his uncle Samuel, but with a gentle humor that reminded Margaret of Daniel at his most playful. He had become fluent in both English and Lakota, serving as translator not just for his family, but for other community members who needed help navigating interactions with white institutions. His academic achievements had earned him a scholarship to attend high school in the state capital, where he would prepare for college and the leadership role that everyone expected him to assume within his community. Daniel, now 13, had developed into a gifted artist whose drawings and paintings captured both traditional Lakota themes and contemporary reservation life with remarkable insight and skill. His artwork had been displayed at the state fair and in several galleries, earning recognition that extended far beyond their local community. But more importantly to Margaret, he had retained the gentle curiosity and emotional intelligence that had first endeared him to her during those frightening days of the flood. Margaret's own transformation had been equally dramatic. At 58, she had become a recognized leader in efforts to improve relations between the reservation and surrounding white communities. Her farmhouse had become a gathering place where people from both cultures met to discuss common concerns, share resources, and plan joint projects that benefited everyone involved. Success of these efforts had not gone unnoticed by government officials and social reformers who were looking for models of peaceful coexistence that could be replicated elsewhere. Margaret had been invited to speak at conferences, write articles for national publications, and consult with communities facing similar challenges. But she had declined most of these opportunities, preferring to focus her energy on the local relationships and projects that had grown from her initial rescue of the boys. On this particular autumn morning, Margaret was preparing for what would be the most significant ceremony of her life among the Lakota people. Samuel had informed her the previous week that the tribal council had voted unanimously to grant her the highest honor available to non-tribal members, adoption as a full sister of the tribe, with all the rights and responsibilities that such status entailed. The ceremony would take place during the annual gathering that commemorated the 5th anniversary of the Great Flood, now recognized as a turning point in relations between the two communities. Representatives from surrounding towns would attend, along with government officials and members of other tribes who had heard about the success of their integration efforts. But for Margaret, the ceremony's significance lay not in its public recognition, but in its acknowledgement of the spiritual and emotional journey she had traveled since that desperate day when she had first spotted two small figures clinging to an oak tree. She had begun that day as an isolated widow with little connection to her community and no sense of purpose beyond simple survival. She would end this day as a recognized leader, beloved aunt and bridge between cultures that had learned to see their common humanity. Mary Crow Feather, now in her 80s but still sharp and active, had spent weeks preparing for the ceremony with the help of other family women. The star quilt that would be presented to Margaret during the adoption ritual was the work of dozens of hands, each stitch carrying prayers and good wishes for her continued role in their community. Joseph and Daniel had also prepared special presentations for the ceremony. Joseph had written a speech in both English and Lakota that traced the impact of Margaret's rescue on their family and community, while Daniel had created a series of paintings that depicted the flood, the rescue, and the relationships that had grown from those traumatic events. As Margaret dressed for the ceremony in the traditional clothing that the family women had made for her, she reflected on how much her understanding of courage had evolved over the past 5 years. She had initially thought of her rescue of the boys as a single act of bravery, completed in a few hours of crisis. But she now understood that the greater courage had been required in the months and years that followed. The courage to open her heart to relationships that challenged her assumptions, the courage to learn new ways of thinking and being, and the courage to become part of something larger than her individual life. The ceremony began with traditional songs and prayers offered by tribal elders who had known Margaret since her first tentative visits to the reservation. These men and women had watched her transformation from uncertain outsider to trusted family member, and their words carried the weight of personal observation and experience. Samuel, now recognized as one of the most influential leaders in the tribal council, offered the formal presentation that would precede Margaret's adoption. His speech traced not just the story of the rescue and its aftermath, but the larger meaning of Margaret's integration into their community. When the Great Flood came 5 years ago, Samuel said to the gathered crowd, it seemed like a disaster that would bring only loss and suffering. We lost homes and livestock, crops and possessions. But the flood also brought us Margaret Thompson, and through her, we learned that disaster can also create opportunities for growth and connection. Samuel went on to describe how Margaret's rescue of Joseph and Daniel had created ripples that touched every aspect of community life. Her presence at family gatherings had led to broader social exchanges between white and Native American families. Her willingness to learn about Lakota culture had encouraged others in the white community to overcome their prejudices and misconceptions. Her advocacy for improved educational opportunities had resulted in programs that benefited children from both communities. But most importantly, Samuel continued, Margaret has shown us that family is not determined by blood alone, but by choice, commitment, and love. She chose to risk her life for children she had never met. She chose to open her heart to relationships that required her to grow and change. She chose to become part of our community not just in name, but in spirit and deed. When Margaret was called forward to receive the formal adoption, she found herself surrounded by faces that had become as familiar as family, which they now truly were. Mary Crow Feather, supported by her walking stick but still dignified and strong, spoke the ancient words that would make Margaret a full member of their tribe. The ceremony was conducted entirely in Lakota, with Joseph providing translation for those community members who needed it. The adoption ritual was followed by the presentation of the new star quilt, this one even more elaborate than the first. But the most meaningful moment came when Daniel stepped forward to present his.